I'm Michael Drum, co-founder of the Tommy Bolin Archives, and I am excited to get to share something today that was close to Tommy Bolin's heart and mine as well. Today we are beaming back to 1971 to explore the tour history of the Mahavishnu Orchestra with Walter Kolosky, author of Mahavishnu Memories. Both Tommy and I were 20 years old and living just doors apart in Boulder. Tommy had already been embraced for his fusion guitar mastery by Jan Hammer and Billy Cobham through Jeremy Steig, who he had met through Eddie Kramer while recording with Zephyr in New York City. So beaming back, Tommy and I were anxiously awaiting the release of the Mahavishnu Orchestra's Intermounting Flame album. John McLaughlin was well known to the Boulder jazz and emerging fusion community for his previous projects. So I'm honored today to be joined by Walter Kolosky, who's been a published author of 2 different books on the Mahavishnu Orchestra and one on John McLaughlin himself. He's the authority. I feel this was some of the most amazing amplified electric music that was ever made. And it had a huge impact on the musical development of Tommy Bolin. And so, Walter, I'm really thrilled that you could join me here to discuss your book.
It's great to be here, Michael. I'm so happy to be able to finally meet you in person, even though it's over the internet.
So, how did you get so obsessed about John McLaughlin back in the day to where you would be here in 2025 still talking about it as if it was yesterday?
You think it had some influence on me, Michael? It probably did. I am one of those people that can say, I heard some music that changed my life, and I've spent a good amount of that life either listening or talking about that music, lecturing about it, writing about it, dreaming about it, every possible aspect of that music. I was impressionable. I was a 16-year-old boy who loved rock and roll music, and I was watching TV late one night, a show called In Concert on ABC TV back in the day in 1973. The show was an hour and a half on Friday nights from 11:30 to 1, and I have to say this particular show sort of sucked. I'm watching it. I came close to turning it off. Then about 20 minutes to 1 or so, this band takes the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, the Mahavishnu Orchestra. At first thought, I said, what the heck is this? Later, I would learn that was Chip Munk, by the way, the Woodstock announcer that did all those announcing chores on In Concert. First, it was a visual thing, Michael, and I saw, back in 1973, rock stars had long hair. And the guy playing the guitar, not only were there 2 necks on the guitar, but he had hair was all cropped. And there was a violin player, which up to that point I hadn't noticed in rock and roll. There were some, but I hadn't noticed one. The bass player had a plexiglass bass. You could see through the bass. I was just stunned at what I saw first. And then they started playing, and my mind would not compute. I was used to 4/4 time and a backbeat that was basically standard and a formula, a rock formula, really a music formula. And I started noticing that many things were going on at once in this music I was listening to. I didn't understand it, but within a few minutes, I was captured by it. The way I've described it to some people is you heard how people have tried to adjust a strobe light to their brain impulses. This is what happened to me that night. Somehow there was this convergence of my brain waves and what I heard coming out of my little 12-inch black and white TV. I literally could not sleep the entire night. I'd never heard anything like that. The next day I went to Mammoth Mart, which was a retail department store in my part of the country, which was Massachusetts. And I picked up Birds of Fire. and I took it home. I was not the richest of kids. I didn't have a regular stereo. I had a turntable that I literally fished out of the dump at the town dump. I had a Heathkit amplifier that I had built because I was into that type of stuff then. In fact, I even had a signal light out of one of my cars, and I hooked it up to the speaker system so I would have a color organ, when the music would play. I'd wrap tinfoil. I'm sounding like a real nerd now, but I had tinfoil that I put in a corner shelf and put the light in front of it. And when the drums would hit, the light would flash up, the room. And I just became enamored to that album. I listened to it over and over, no lyrics or anything. And of course, I was a regular guy. I listened to rock music at the time. I was into Black Sabbath and 10 Years After and, bands like that. In a decent way, I was. And but through Birds of Fire, I found out that it wasn't Mahavishnu's first album. They had put out Intermounting Flame, and that wasn't John McLaughlin, the guitar player. That wasn't his first album. He had been on Miles Davis albums, and Miles Davis had been on albums. And so I literally went from my 100% rock and roll world to jazz fusion. It wasn't called that yet, but to jazz fusion and into jazz. And I could appreciate everything that came before it. And as the years passed, I found more and more solace. It wasn't some anxiety problem I had, but I found more and more solace in this music. And I became enamored with it deeply.
I want you to then first go into who was in this first version of the Mahavishnu's, this violin player, this clear plexiglass bass player. Who are the subjects here of this story?
Well, the leader of the band was John McLaughlin, the guitar player, who I would later find out, was a session player in England in the early 60s, played with Jack Bruce and all of these people, really a jazzer, but could play anything, and then started, I'm going to say experimenting, sort of fusing jazz and rock. He wasn't the first. But he would end up being the first really commercially successful player, in my opinion, with Mahavishnu. And he played with Dave Holland in England and some of these people who immigrated to the U.S. to play and who met Miles Davis. And Miles Davis got wind of John, and Tony Williams, the great jazz drummer, got wind of John. And he came over to the United States on the invite of Tony Williams, who formed this band called Lifetime, which was a vision that Tony had of, I'm going to say, sort of a modern rock band, controlled by jazz. That jazz was the main controller of this band. So that was John. Through his time with Tony Williams and Miles Davis, it became apparent that he should form his own band, as advised by Miles Davis. John had become, I'm not going to say religious person, I'm going to say spiritual person,
Yep.
which to a degree was not that unusual then. The degree to which he would take it would be, but it wasn't unknown at that time. I mean, the Beatles were seeing, spiritual people in Mahesh Yogi and things of that nature. It didn't stand out at the beginning. It would later. But when it was time to form a band, he was looking for people, and people were recommended to him. Billy Cobham, who
Was
had
he
played.
first? That's what I've heard, that they first got together and did a little playing.
Yeah, Billy Cobham was first, and I think that was out of just sort of circumstance because he had met him during Miles Davis sessions. So we heard about the violinist Jerry Goodman, who was in this rock band called The Flock, and of course The Flock, out of Chicago, in and of itself was sort of a dynamic band, rock music, and obviously with a violinist in it. sort of rock, folk, jazz is the way I would describe that band. And at a certain point, John heard one of their albums and heard Jerry, and he said, "That's the sound I'm looking for. That's who I want." As far as the keyboard player, Jan Hammer from Czechoslovakia was recommended to him. Jan Hammer had played with the great jazz singer Sarah Vaughan, was backing her up. And I still remember John's reaction at the time, and he said, Sarah Vaughan doesn't put up with any shit. And so Jan Hammer joined on electric piano, basically, and piano, and that would later change into the synthesizer and piano, well, everything at that time. Rick Laird was somebody that John did know from England and had played in bands during his London days. For people wanting to know the history, I published a book years ago called Power, Passion, and Beauty that goes through the formation of that band, the success of the band, and the demise of that band. But Rick Laird, he came in to sort of provide the standard backing sound of that bass. All the members for the new book that I have were interviewed, and plus many, many other people that I reached out to get information from.
Once they started practicing and whatever, it was basically to do John's compositions. Is that correct? This was the driving piece of it, that John was writing a whole new group of pieces of music for this band, and that is what the band was going to do.
100%. And there's an interesting story that Jan told me. In fact, John Abercrombie had told me part of this as well. John knew John Abercrombie and Jan were friends at that time. Jan brought some music back from the rehearsals. And Jan and John Abercrombie looked at it and said, "What the hell is this? What is this?" It turns out later that John would write in sort of sketches, thematic sketches, and then each player would add, what they could add to value of the piece. It was a jazz band, basically, which is what caused confusion, but also success and interest.
What was the hallmark right off the bat of what this group could do? And I think that's a good phrase, what they could do, which I believe was what was different from what had gone on before, is that John wanted to try to do things new things that hadn't been done before. And so how can you speak about the music in terms of it being that?
Well, the first thing that would strike you, because it's only the first note or the first beat, is just utter loudness, the volume. Now, plenty of people could do that, so I'm not saying that that's set them apart. But from a jazz perspective, if you were entering a venue thinking you're going to hear a jazz band, which you would be hearing, but unprepared for that volume, it knocked you back in your seat. It really did. It literally knocked people back in their seats. But as far as the mechanisms of the band, it was the ability to play in different time signatures at different times.
Would these be time signatures that perhaps were not commonly utilized in?
Yes, absolutely. And that the first time I was listening to that music, that's what was throwing me off. Like your brain is expecting it to go into one direction, and you realize it's going into two directions. It's difficult to say, two directions that meet up without meeting up. I mean, it's sort of, it's fascinating when you listen to it. And sometimes over the years, I've had the opportunity to introduce that music, and it's such a thrill. I mean, somebody, 20, 30 years later, never heard the music. And, I push a button and the music starts, and they start looking at me and go, "What the heck?" And even now, even though, it's been highly copied, over the years, this method of playing, if you want to call it a method. Approach, yeah. It's still shocking to people. And I remember I was in the business world for years, and an old business friend of mine was visiting me here. I live in Natick, but he was here in business. I said, let's get together. And so we're talking music in the car on the way to the, I think, Chinese restaurant. And he says, what do you listen to? And I said, you don't want to hear it. I just automatically said, you don't want to hear it because you're not going to be able to take it. I really said that to him. You're not going to really be able to take it because I knew him, I knew what he was about. And he says, you're shortchanging me here, sort of saying I can't take it. What does that mean? I want to hear it now. I want to hear some music. I said, okay, Bob. And, so I pushed my CD player and it was Birds of Fire. He lasted less than a minute before he begged me to turn that off. He couldn't take it. And sometimes the music might, have that effect on people, that it's too much. And I always used to say that, you're a fan of jazz fusion music, good jazz fusion, or good jazz rock, because a lot of it wasn't. But if you could go to sleep to it, which I certainly could. I'd go to bed. We'd have to stack the records. Not good for the record player back then, but we'd stack the records, and I'd make it to the first record before I fell asleep. And that's pretty aggressive music. And I've sort of always used that marker. That's how you understand the music, you get into it, you hear the melody. Lots of people don't hear the melody. I mean, I certainly can hum Mahavishnu. I can hum Tommy Bolin. I can hum that music because somewhere and somehow I'm one of the persons that's been given the gift of being able to communicate this way. It's a two-way communication between artist and listener.
Yep.
And to me, that's the greatest communication that there is. And that's always a one-on-one communication, whether it's music, reading, paintings. It's one-on-one. It's not to the crowd. It's one-on-one. And I've always garnered great pleasure from this ability.
And I would say that make a judgment, sweeping judgment. Well, most people are conditioned by the music that they've been exposed to. And in most cases, for a lot of us, that's music that becomes popular. And popular music tends to then be very predictable with memorable melodies, and that this is what becomes successful. And so many people this is what their education is. And as you noted, when you first listened to Mahavishnu, this was not that. This was anything but that. And that certain people just went, whoa. And one of those people, of course, was Tommy Bolin. So they go into the studio and they're starting to get Intermounting Flame done. Columbia Records is obviously very excited. Who was their shepherd at Columbia Records? Who was the executive there who was excited about this project?
Well, this would be Clive Davis, who was head of Columbia at that time. The story is interwoven. Who was interested at first? I mean, sometimes, Clive Davis might say, I discovered Mahavishnu. Well, not really. But was he open to it? Yes. Was that because Miles Davis told him to be open to it? Probably. That's my guess. Did he like John McLaughlin when they met to discuss signing him? Clive Davis says yes. That he liked the confidence that John had when he was talking about this music. And John sort of proved Clive Davis's feelings right. He proved him to be correct in this sense. There's a whole lot about Clive Davis and some other things in this book, because it's just not about live performances, but that's who, when you have the bigwig, you're going to get funded for recordings, your name is going to get around, and you're going to get some gigs.
And then, of course, for that to then get triggered, you need to have a manager. That tends to be the way it works. Nat Weiss was the manager. He had started Nemperor Artist Management when he came to New York in 1968 after Brian Epstein had died. And of course, that's who signed Tommy Bolin to Emperor Records. So Nat is a person that a lot of the Tommy fans don't, they're into the music. And
Right.
so who were the people behind the curtain? So let's talk a little bit about Nat Weiss, who was a major, major dude behind that curtain. And how did he wind up engaging with John?
Well, it's interesting because ostensibly he was an attorney. He wasn't a music manager to begin with. That sort of happened through his friendship with Brian Epstein, the Beatles manager, and of course his representation of the Beatles and other people. James Taylor was another client, and he became involved in management this way.
He was kind of carrying on because he had gotten involved with Brian. Brian had NEMS, and that they had a number of other managers. They managed Cream, and a lot of people don't know that NEMS, through Robert Stigwood, managed Cream, and that's so Cream and the Beatles were, management mates. Brian then passes away in '67, which of course was a really tumultuous time for the Beatles. But Nat had become very, very close to Brian.
I certainly, on a legal basis in the U.S., they were working with each other because of the Beatles. And of course, it was in Nat Weiss's office that Paul McCartney met Linda Eastman. These things are all connected in some way. And in fact, Nat, I don't know, you tell me if he directed Tommy the same way, but he decided he's going to follow Brian Epstein's formula for making the Beatles successful, and that was to get them to play as many concerts as possible. And this was the way he decided to run Mahavishnu.
So was he very hands-on with Mahavishnu? Because Nat was at that point was starting to build this empire.
Yes and no. If there's a criticism of Nat, it would be that he wasn't hands-on enough about the actual management of the band. He knew everybody. So people wanted to do favors for Nat Weiss. And of course, he was a money man. I mean, he knew how to make money. And this was important if you wanted to succeed. But as far as the music, I interviewed Nat, many years ago, and he was a very interesting guy to talk to. But he would have just as much interest in financing a Broadway play as he would Mahavishnu, and maybe too much, in that sense, that he would pay attention to other things. And there's been some criticism, especially toward the end of the band, that Nat could have managed things better to keep them together and things of that nature, but he just wasn't that type of person.
Right.
I'll admit, a great charismatic character. I mean, nobody's, and who knows if he wasn't there at the beginning, whether Mahavishnu would have happened in the way it happened, and they gained the success that they did. But he says the way it developed, to be cool, you almost sort of had to like it, even if you didn't. This is what he said. He knows that some executives would come down and maybe they didn't like the music, but they did like the music because they knew what it meant in some sense to their career or, whatever was going to happen. They saw the audience reaction, and it was hip in the earliest days for these stodgy music corporate types to like the music.
Who want it to be kind of comprehensible. If we're going to get behind this thing, what path is it following that we're already familiar with?
Right.
And Mahavishnu wasn't doing that. They were
No.
doing something different. So do you believe that Nat, beyond the way you just explained that in his heart of hearts, in his ear, that he heard what was special about Mahavishnu, or was it more that he got that there was significance here that would then wind up being able to be maneuvered to where it could?
I think he did. I mean, when you look at some of the other musicians that he was involved with, as I mentioned, James Taylor's Cat Stevens, those those players played very different music from each other. Um, but of course, when he started going into the music business himself, you know, with the Tommy, Jan Hammer, Stanley
Stan,
Clark,
yep.
you know, that was a particular type of music. My feeling is, at a certain point, if we enjoy what we're doing, that's what we try to stay with. And to me, the continued support of the music that came after the successful bands indicates to me that he enjoyed that type of music. My guess is he probably enjoyed all types of music, and could appreciate the talent of musicians no matter what genre they occupied.
So I think it's fascinating that for the various reasons that he signed to Nemper Artist Management, Mahavishnu Orchestra as a client. And again, he had James Taylor as a client. He also had signed Peter Asher as a client as a producer. And so
Right.
then everything Peter produced from that on, initially from that point on, it was because he was managed by Nat. So Nat was like getting in the middle of everything. As he did with Tommy, he gave Mahavishnu, John McLaughlin, free reign. No, there were no guardrails, no fences, no dictates. John, you go hit it out of the park. And of course, with Intermounting Flame, I think the world of people who could hear it went, we can't even see the park. It's so far
Right.
gone. But there was no system in place to support what John had come up with. And so this is, I think, a good segue into the book, Mahavishnu Memories, which again is a breakout of every single concert this band did. And I think the thing that's so interesting about it is how many pairings there were with rock bands that had nothing to do with what John McLaughlin was doing. And it's like putting a square peg into a hole that's not even there, in a sense, to have all these billings where they're stuck in the middle of, so it was going to be, okay, we're going to get out there. So let's talk just a little bit about that strategy, which again is akin to what your book's about. What are some of the early shows that you could mention to us where the billings were a little bit head scratching, perhaps?
Yeah, well, to be clear, you know, the bills back in those days were a little more eclectic.
Yep.
But even so, not as eclectic as having the Mahavishnu Orchestra on the bill. So you would have the first act that they were billed with was a venerable old blues man, John Lee Hooker. And in the early days, and this is in the first couple of months, Michael, imagine playing with on the same bill as Oscar Peterson, and Steve Miller Band. That was a bill. Steve Miller Band, Mahavishnu, and Oscar Peterson. But what would happen in the earliest days is you have to imagine the shock. The audiences were stunned. There were literally this force of volume and
Wall of sound. Can I just say
this
wall?
wall of sound
It's
and
that
this
Maxell print ad from back in the day. The guy
exactly.
sitting there sitting in his chair with his hair blown back because of the
Well,
walls.
Ruth Underwood used to refer to that commercial when she was in the Zappa band. That the first time the mothers saw Mahavishnu open, that's what she thought. She saw the whole audience just go back to the back of their chairs. But it was the shock, and then you add the virtuosity on top of that, the volume, it was a physical experience. And yes, in hindsight, it was too loud. A lot of damaged ears can attest to that. But when music was that loud, at least the theory goes, at least I've read it someplace and used it over the years, is that nothing else exists at that moment except that sound, that music, and yourself. And you can either take it or not. I interviewed Herbie Hancock one time, and he told me about going to see Tony Williams' Lifetime. And of course, Tony Williams' lifetime was very loud as well. And Herbie said he made the conscious decision, knowing that he was probably going to damage his hearing, to sit there and listen, because the virtuosity of it was so overwhelming that he could not listen. But he knew he'd pay a price in the end. And so when Mahavishnu came out, people would get up and run out of the theater. Jan Hammer used to laugh. He used to laugh when he'd see this. As the Oscar Peterson show in particular, Rick Laird, this is in the book, he had invited his old jazz mates from Australia there, got them front row seats. And these were traditional jazz players. Like, what is this new thing that Rick Laird is doing? And they sat in the front row. They hit the first note, and Rick says he looked down and he saw every one of them get up and run out of the theater. This was the Beacon Theater, ran right out of the theater. They had no idea what just hit them. And this is, I'm going to say, for the first year and a half before people really knew who Mahavishnu was, that this was the number one result of shock. And it's a modern phrase now to say shock and awe. Now, you had the people that liked it, and then you obviously had people that were repulsed by it. This is too loud. The songs are too long. Where are the lyrics?
Where are my familiar 4/4 beats?
Right. Where are those? At the same time, the band, even at loud volume, could slow down and play pieces that you would consider to be classical in nature, because they had the skills and the abilities to do this. To me, I had written so much about Mahavishnu and not spent enough time talking about the phenomenon of the live performance. This is really why I decided to write about every show, because there's an arc to this story, even though it's just about tour. But not just any tour. Their road manager, Elliot Sears, described it as one long, continuous tour, which was so unlike other rock bands at the time that would tour for a couple of months and then take 4 or 6 months off and make a new album.
And again, that was because of Nat. Is that correct?
Yeah, right. So Mahavishnu didn't do that. They just continued to play. But even in 1973, the last year of the band, 2 years after it was formed, people still could go to a show and not be prepared. They just, what is this? And literally in his story, I try to get as many different stories as I can in the book, from people that were there, people that opened for the band, people that worked with the band, all sorts of people that were part of this time.
And it's that's where the fascination, I think, of this is.
Thank you.
A parachute drop right into the middle of what was going on, all the people, all the musicians, everything. And so that's what I love. That's what I love in a music book, is to feel like I'm being taken back and dropped into it.
I got a fan letter the other day that really raised my spirits, and his name was David, and he sent me a note, and he said, when I read about the concert that I had attended, the chills went back up my spine again when he read about it. And I said, boy, that makes me so happy. But people would leave these concerts and file out silently. They did not know what hit them. And you've read the book, which I appreciate, and there are stories of people getting into the car, the group that all went to see the band, and driving home and not saying a word the entire time home, because they didn't know what to say. And in fact, there are reviewers in this book I did so much research for this book, which was part of the fun, who literally will start the review, say, I'm not going to write anything because I can't. Let's talk about the other band, or something of that nature, or talk about the effect that the music had on everybody. For researching this book, I went back into the archives, I traveled, I tracked down people. Elliot Sears, who I dedicated the book to, had a lot of material, had some itineraries. I literally went back and tracked down people that were on the itineraries from 1971 and 72 and 73. I tracked down members of backup, bands that backed them up. What was it like? And lots of times we died 1,000 deaths, because the crowd was expecting something and we were not that. But other times people would say they raised the level of our music. We felt, wow, this is what we're doing. We need to get more serious. And one of those bands, Yes, who even to this day discuss the influence that Mahavishnu Orchestra had on them and their performance. John Anderson's in this book, talked to him. And this applies, to quite a few bands. Now, of course, they weren't always the most popular band, even on the same bill. But if you read this book, you'll see the trajectory of the band and its popularity almost weekly rise up as people discover this new music. And I provide as best I can all the behind the scenes reasons for that. This genre of tour histories is quite a well-known one. This one, I decided to really make it personal, that people that were there, it's going to bring back amazing memories, and it's going to want to make other people wish they were there.
One thing I wanted to bring up here has to do with the point of how loud it was. And in looking at the arc of guitar players from late 60s, the one artist who came along who changed all the rules was, of course, Jimi Hendrix. And he then brought that whole idea of just sonic explosion, the feedback, everything that he did. So what I wound up reading was that part of what influenced Miles Davis was John, in the Bitches Brew period, taking Miles to see the Monterey Pop documentary in Greenwich Village, and that was Miles's introduction to Jimi Hendrix. Is I'm making the assumption, which you can either validate or not, that that's what led to John deciding to be playing at such a volume, and that he was inspired by what Jimmy was doing. And John, of course, wasn't going to try to do what Jimmy was doing, but that piece of the volume, in your face, people peeled back in their seats, that was first manifested in a really romantic way by Jimmy.
I could see it. I can't tell you that I know it. I certainly can tell you that John was a tremendous fan of Jimi Hendrix, and I would say that the unabashed playing, the in-your-face playing, I can see that as coming from Jimi Hendrix, but I don't know the timing of the volume thing because, of course, Lifetime was super loud. But of course, Tony, he admired Hendrix and the drummers around that time, and that was loud music, and rock and roll itself was loud.
It was getting loud at that
point. So it's funny. Years later, I went to see Black Sabbath, and I was disappointed they weren't loud enough, which is interesting perspective. He clearly, the mantle, if we want to use it that way, he picked up the mantle from Jimmy, from many people. Um, and the thing about loud guitar is that this was loud improvisation and going for the limits. Now, to my ears, sometimes the instrument that hurts my ears is really high pitched violin playing. Sometimes that just, like a knife, is gone into your ear. But those guys could get up into that volume, and when you're seeking whatever John was seeking on that guitar with this abandon, always, by the way, within a structure. That's what people have to understand who think, oh, it's just some noise. They're mistaken. It might be noise to them, but there is a structure, and it's interesting to note that the John McLaughlin guitar player of 1985 was better than the John McLaughlin player of the Mahavishnu Orchestra in 1972. You see, it might take some time to wrap your head around that, but that's true. It's all about a place and time. Um, that volume, that power, I certainly think, came from the Jimi Hendrix. And in fact, even in Jimi Hendrix books, from then McLaughlin's mentioned often. And of course, he talks about Jimi, quite often as well. And in fact, he played, I'm going to say 1979, 1980-ish. He played the Jimi Hendrix Guitar Festival up in, is that in Oregon they have that?
It was Paul Allen, I think, who was doing it. So maybe it was Seattle.
Yeah, it could have been Seattle. I think you're correct. Seattle, Washington. And Paul, who is a fan of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, by the way, I think he saw John, one of the last tours that John did in the U.S. He came and saw him. That volume, for all of its, it had its seeds in Hendrix and that type of music. And who knows what would happen with Jimmy. And of course, there was the rumor that Miles wanted to play with Jimmy. And in finding out that Jimmy was able to play the way he did, but could not read music, which just blows my mind.
And Tommy Bull had exactly the same thing,
Yeah,
to where he couldn't read. But all these cats wanted to play with Jimmy. They all wanted to play with Tommy, as it turns out. And of course, Tommy also heard Jimmy in '67. And what he really took from that was you could be free. You didn't have to do things within a preordained format, wearing a suit and tie.
yeah.
And that's what Jimmy, when he first blew up in '67, it was about being free, like stone free to do what I want. And that
That's
he
what
he, rep, he represented that visually also.
yeah, that's what jazz music is to me. It's a freedom, and even within the structure of any type of music, you have to be free.
So I want to wrap up this segment right here and hold the book up, which when I got it, I was, of course, curious about the mentions of Tommy that might have been in here because he was certainly a player in that whole world back then. And then in going through it, I all of a sudden saw that I was in the book from a review I wrote when I saw Mahavishnu Orchestra at the Denver Coliseum in 1972. So let's, with that little self-serving reference there,
Start this segment maybe with you seeing Mahavishnu, and we can, if that's what you planned, then I'm with you.
Walter, this is just amazing. We're going to continue on. I'm going to put your website address on the screen here because that's where you can find out about all of Walter's 3 books. And let's just tick those off first of all that you did in order, the books you've written about Mahavishnu or John McLaughlin.
That would be Power, Passion, and Beauty, the story of the legendary Mahavishnu Orchestra in 2006. Follow Your Heart, John McLaughlin Song by Song, where I describe every song he was on, basically, was from 2011. And then, of course, Mahavishnu Memories here in 2024, back in December of 2024.
And so this is just fascinating. I hope that this inside baseball format is working for everybody. If not, I know I'm having a good time. So, and at the bottom line of it all, that's all that's important, especially here in early 2025. So we're going to be back shortly, and do join us for the next thrill-packed episode in Mahavishnu Memories with Walter Kowalski.